history of Canadian military camouflage patterns. Welcome back to another episode, guys. Today we're going to do something a little different and talk about all the various camouflage patterns that the Canadian military has used historically all the way up till now. We're not just going to look at the various uniform patterns, but we're going to look at camo patterns of vehicles, vessels, and aircraft as well. Now, we're not going to look at all the historical uniforms that the Canadian military has used. That's for a completely different video if you guys want to see that. Let's take a look. When it comes to survival in war, camouflage has been used in one way or another since the beginning of time. It has evolved from using darkness, terrain, foliage, and your surrounding environment to advanced scientifically engineered patterns and designs. Now you can trace the birth of modern military camouflage in Canada back to World War I, with the various patterns that the Royal Canadian Navy would use to confuse onlookers at sea. These patterns were referred to as disruptive dazzle, while during World War II, we would see Canada adopt various standardized official camouflage patterns for its uniforms, kit, and vehicles. The Canadian Army officially adopted a two-tone camouflage pattern for its vehicles in 1939 based off a British training pamphlet. The two colors being khaki green G3 and light green number 5 that would later be replaced by a dark muddy gray color called Noble's Dark Tarmac number 4. Now, I couldn't find much by means of official government paint codes and designations during or pre-World War II. The task was a little trickier than I thought, but thanks to the people at hedgehoghollow.com and the International Plastic Modelers Society of Canada, I was able to find an in-depth analysis of the Canadian color standards. Not only that, it explains the British color standards and the American system. The emergence of standardized camo patterns on Canadian military clothing and kit also appeared during World War II. Men from the Canadian 1st Parachute Regiment, who were attached to the British 6th Airborne Division, wore British-made Denison smocks in a unique hand-printed brushstroke pattern that would later spawn a large branch of similar derivative patterns still used today. Canadian jumpers would continue to sport these Denison smocks for several years after the war, but they gradually phased out as there was never a homegrown version produced to replace them. It wouldn't be till the late 1970s that we see a re-emergence of camo patterns on Canadian combat uniforms. In 1975, the Canadian Airborne Regiment was issued its first camouflage garment in almost 25 years. A DPM pattern smock inspired by the World War II pattern that would be the only officially issued camouflage garment until the regiment was disbanded in 1995. In 1989, however, the Canadian government briefly adopted a bizarre camouflage pattern for its garrison jacket, which was never intended for combat use. It was a dark, blobby woodland camouflage pattern, which was actually rumored to be inspired by a Canadian Tire brand of duck hunter clothing and camouflage. For the next quarter century, the standard Canadian battle dress uniform would be a single color olive drab green, no pattern whatsoever. But with the adoption of the M1 steel helmet in the 1960s, Canada would receive an assortment of various American camouflage pattern helmet covers. They'd also receive other American camouflage kit like tarpaulins, truck tarpaulins, canteen covers, and ranger blankets. Now, although the Canadian military officially adopted the M1 helmet in the 1960s, it saw limited use with Canadian parachute regiments in World War II, where they would make their own homegrown camouflage patterns out of scrim or cannibalized parachute shroud, which was also called frog skin camouflage, which looked very similar to the U.S. Marine Corps pattern. And some members would actually paint their own camouflage patterns on their helmet covers, as seen here. The first of these American M1 helmet cover patterns would have been the Mitchell reversible vine leaf or wine leaf pattern, which was also called the ERDL transition pattern. In the 1980s, Canadians would receive M81 woodland helmet covers for their M1 helmets, also with limited use of the PASGT helmets that Canada used briefly. All these patterns would eventually be replaced in the 1990s with the adoption of the CG634 ballistic helmet, and now with the adoption of new helmets and a new CADPAT camouflage pattern called CADPAT MT, we're seeing the helmet covers being replaced by the CADPAT MT pattern. CADPAT first came in the form of helmet covers in 1997 and then became the standard dress uniform for the Canadian Forces in 2002. With the adoption of the CG634 ballistic helmet in the 1990s with its CADPAT or Canadian Digital Disruptive Pattern helmet covers came the CADPAT uniforms themselves shortly after. Now, CADPAT was a uniquely Canadian designed and engineered digital pattern which actually set a trend throughout militaries across the planet, allied and non-allied. America came out with a very similar pattern pattern very shortly after CADPAT called MARPAT, which the Marines used, and then the American Army followed shortly after with their version of the American ACU pattern. In Canada, however, CADPAT would evolve into 4 main versions. Aside from test patterns, 4 official patterns would emerge, and they were CADPAT Arid, or the away jersey, CADPAT Temperate Woodland, or the home jersey, CADPAT Winter for the Winter Classic, and now of course CADPAT MT, or multi-terrain, which is now replacing both the Arid and Temperate Woodland camouflage pattern. Now on the other hand, CANSOFCOM, or Canadian Special Operations Forces Command, uses multicam for its assaulters and its supporters. This is quite common throughout Special Forces communities across allied nations. Now there's been various unofficial uses of camouflage by Canadian soldiers in theater and combat operations. You might have seen Canadian door gunners wearing American ACU vests, or Canadians wearing some sort of American pattern on their kit in Afghanistan or Iraq. There was unofficial usages of foreign camouflage patterns used by Canadians overseas, and that would have been sanctioned by their unit or some chain of command, but those camouflage patterns were not officially adopted by the Canadian forces. So as far as Canadian uniforms and kit go, that's pretty much the extent for camouflage patterns for the Canadian Army. Now we can talk about the official color standards and the color patterns used on Canadian Army vehicles and Canadian Air Force aircraft. So, according to our friends at hedgehoghollow.com and the people of IPMS, the official Canadian government document or catalog of color standard is called 1-GP-12B and would be later revised and updated as 1-GP-12C. Now, this catalog was officially created by the Canadian General Standards Board. Now, this entire Canadian catalog would be replaced by the American Federal Standard, or FS, later, and we'll talk about that in just a bit. Now, the British would use the letters BS for their standards, or British Standard. If we take a look at this should give us a better understanding of the color standards used by Canada, Britain, and America. This excerpt comes from the book by Patrick Martin called Canadian Armed Forces, Aircraft Finish and Markings, 1968 to 1997. It reads as follows. Color standard. The Canadian Forces Air Element have used 4 main color definition systems. Post-World War II colors were from the British Standard BS 381 and were used on early camouflage types, such as those employed on the Royal Canadian Air Force NATO bases in Europe. The first Canadian standard used was Standard Paint Colors Part 1, Color Identification and Selection, or 1-GP-12B, released in 1957. It was an illustrated list of colors and remained current until just after unification. Colors listed in 1-GP-12B and used by the Royal Canadian Air Force would be in Canadian Armed Forces use for only a short period between February 1, 1968 and when drawings were converted universally in March 1968. 1-GP-12C, the Canadian standard, was printed in 1965 but adopted by the Canadian Armed Forces in 1968, shortly after unification. The first digit referred to which of the 6 sections within the 1-GP-12C binder the color sample could be found. The second and third digit were color grouping code. The following were used by the Canadian Armed Forces: gray 01, blue 02, green 03, brown 04, yellow 05, red 09, black 12, white 13, and aluminum 15. The first digit after the grouping code was 1 for gloss, 2 for semi-gloss, or 3 for flat. The last 2 digits were the actual color. The Canadian system did not use descriptive names like the American FS 595, 36375 color light compass gray, and the British BS 381C number 640 extra dark sea gray system. In 1989, the Canadian government discontinued production of 1-GP-12C, hence a new color system was needed for standard. FS 595, or Federal Standard 595, was first issued from the United States government in 1956 and continuously updated by adding letter extensions when full reprints with all additions were done. In this well thought out system, the first digit 1, 2, or 3 refers to, in American terminology, gloss, semi-gloss, and lusterless. The second digit referred to basic color groups as follows: brown 0, red 1, orange 2, yellow 3, green 4, blue 5, gray 6, mist 7, and fluorescent 8. The 1-GP-12C colors were gradually replaced by the American Federal Standard 595, starting with the Buffalo 3-color wraparound scheme in November 1983. A conversion list was made, but there was only 2 exact matches within 1-GP-12C colors, as they were intended to match Hornet FS 595 color. The list uses the words "we can live with" in reference to the conversion equivalent: Cosmopolitan, Labrador, Tudor, Buffalo, CF5, Tracker, Sea King, Hercules, CT-133 Silver Star, Boeing 707, Twin Otter, Jet Ranger, Aurora, Dash 7, Challenger, and Hornet were converted to the FS 595 standards by November 1993. The Musketeer and Chinook had paint spec drawings made up but not painted. The Twin Huey was only partially converted, and the Labrador was the last to convert. The marking drawing colors started switching in March 1991 with the new signature. The Griffin and the Polaris were noted with the FS 595 spec from the outset. Now, during the Cold War era, Canadian military aircraft and vehicles would almost exclusively sport woodland camouflage patterns that were suited for European theater operations. The vast majority of Canadian military aircraft and vehicles would utilize some form of tri-color paint scheme, utilizing 3 colors. So, for example, here, the Lynx, Cuckvy,
Tactical,
Bison, Cougar, truck covers, and the M113 TLAV would all use some variation of a tricolor camouflage pattern scheme listed from right here, using any one of these colors from the 1-GP-12C catalog. But oddly enough, I was able to find some pictures of Canadian Army vehicles sporting a 2-tone color pattern. Which is pretty fucking wild. I know, my mouth dropped too. Now, while those older aircraft and vehicles would be using the 1-GP-12B or C catalog, relatively newer vehicles and aircraft like the CH-146 Griffin and CH-147F Chinook would use the American Federal Standard. Now, the Cold War era aggressor squadrons of the RCAF brought camouflage patterns to a whole new level with their CF-5D Freedom Fighters. Aggressor squadrons mimic the tactics and styles of enemy fighters, most notably Russia, which would use wild camouflage pattern schemes on their aircraft during this era. The CF-5As and CF-5D Freedom Fighters, or CF-116s, would employ a whole host of camouflage patterns, from aggressor squadrons to European woodland camouflage patterns suited for European operations during the Cold War. The aggressor squadrons would use 4 main camouflage patterns, which they actually gave names to, which were the Grape Scheme, early and later Lizard Pattern Scheme, the Faux Pas Scheme, and the Ghost Camouflage Pattern. We would also see various RCAF aircraft like the Hercules and Buffalo use tri-color camouflage pattern schemes, also suited for European woodland operations, also suited for European theater operations during the Cold War. Another notable camouflage pattern that I would like to highlight is the Royal Canadian Air Force Search and Rescue paint scheme that they use, called Tiger Paint. Now, it's not really a camo pattern, but I think it's pretty cool and I think it's worth mentioning, and you can take a look at it here if you want. Anyways, that's all I got for you guys today. I hope that was informative for you and interesting. If not, let me know in the comment and give me some constructive criticism. If you've got any ideas for videos, let me know. I'd love to hear them. Thanks, guys. Northern Liberty Matt out.